Good morning, everyone. Happy Tuesday. Hope everyone's having a good morning so far. As Anthony mentioned, we're going to be talking about the GLBA. So I know an exciting topic for early in the morning on a Tuesday. Hopefully, you all will gain something from this and learn something maybe that you didn't know before or have a good refresher. And we'll have some opportunity for questions a little later on, so feel free to put those in the chat as we go through. We've got some breaks built in for organically. We'll take the polls where we can answer some of those questions. Otherwise, we'll look at some of those questions at the end and try to get to as many of those as we can. Again, my name is Jeff Hay. It's great to see some familiar names. I looked at the attendee list. Many of you I've met via Teams or in person. So it's great to see you again. And for those I haven't, it's great to meet you this morning. Hopefully, again, you get something out of this and you really enjoy it. But if you're an EDUCAUSE member, also, we're a member of EDUCAUSE. Please come see us in the fall later this year. I know a handful of you did last year at the fall meeting, so I know that's a little bit ahead of time, but definitely come by and see us if you do attend that sort of event. We do have a pretty wide audience this morning. There's a lot of different job titles here, so this is going to be more of a general presentation about the GLBA. We have CFOs, COOs, EVPs, controllers, compliance folks. So really kind of a good gamut of folks that we can talk through different aspects of the GLBA and how it applies. I work in the cloud and security portion of our business under the technology umbrella that was shown in the earlier slide, also known as the risk practice. So we deal with all of the alphabet soup of acronyms that are out there for compliance: GLBA, CMMC, PCI. We may be the only folks that like acronyms as much as our federal government does. So definitely we'll have some of those. I'll try to make sure that we're defining those as we go along. That way you don't have any questions on that. And also, if you are on the social media LinkedIn, definitely add me on there. We do post a lot of content about the GLBA, about other compliances, general cybersecurity in general. Again, we're excited to have you here this morning with us. You can expect us to touch on some of the major ideas shown here, and hopefully you gain that valuable insight when you go to review your GLBA requirements or look to evaluate vendors for services. We would also be happy to meet with any one of you individually if you have specific questions regarding the content today, or you just want to dive deeper into one of these particular agenda items. So kicking things off, we'll talk about the history of the GLBA. How did it begin and what are its primary goals? Where was the genesis of it? We'll also review the current requirements as of 2025. We'll take a deep dive into those individual safeguards requirements. Many of you have already been through an audit. You already are familiar with a lot of these, but we'll dive deeply into those. And then we'll look at the components of a good risk assessment. So as you're doing these risk assessments that are required, either internally or with a third party, we'll look at what constitutes a good risk assessment. We'll talk about what that looks like. We'll look at some commonly identified risks. We've worked with a number of clients over the last couple of years for GLBA. We'll look at some of those risks that we see among a lot of clients. We'll also review the components of a good penetration test. So for those that have greater than 5,000 records, we know there's a requirement for penetration testing. We'll look at what that looks like and what you should be looking for in your penetration test reports. Then also we'll review the 2024 data breach requirement that began later last year and what that looks like and what you should expect. We'll go through some common questions and then hopefully, as I said, have some time for some individual questions. So we'll jump in, as I mentioned, about the history of the GLBA to start. The Gramm-Leach-Bliley Act, we like to refer to it as GLBA, much easier to say. It's been around for about 25 years, originally began with traditional financial institutions. So think about your banks, credit unions, savings and loan, those types of organizations, those that are dealing with activity that's financial in nature. So that would have been extending loans, checking credit, maintaining financial information, account numbers, social security numbers, etc. The expansion of the GLBA is what leads us here today, right? So now higher education institutions, those giving financial aid, are required to be in compliance with this GLBA Act. The FTC has decided that these types of institutions need guidelines for maintaining the privacy of consumer data. The majority of what we're going to cover today can be found in the 16 CFR section 314.4, which I'm all too familiar with, and I'm sure many of you are all too familiar with. But if you can't sleep tonight, maybe you want some light reading, definitely hit up the Code of Federal Regulations 314.4. It might put you right to sleep. So the definition of the GLBA, or those financial institutions, was expanded just a few years ago. And kind of surprising, some of the industries that were added in to this, in some ways it was surprising and in other ways not, because of the types of information that they would hold. So not only do the higher education financial aid institutions fall under this now, there's automotive dealerships have to deal with this, mortgage brokers are dealing with GLBA, real estate appraisers, and some accountants and tax preparation services. So as we think about the overarching goals of the GLBA, we think about three separate things. The first is confidentiality, ensuring that the information that we hold for students, in this case, is confidential. Secondly, a protection against anticipated threats. So recognizing threats to that information, the security of that information, and maintaining the integrity of that information. And finally, the last goal is protecting against unauthorized use or access. So the reason for this is we want to make sure, as people who are holding student data, that there isn't unauthorized access to that information that could harm that consumer. The original implementation date, which many of us are familiar with, was June 9th, 2023. We're now almost 2 years in to the implementation. We still see clients of varying degrees. Some are really doing well with the implementation. Others are still struggling with a few of the aspects. So we want to make sure that you understand all of the aspects and what's to be expected during that audit. So we also know that covered institutions have to have that information security program with our administrative, technical, and physical safeguards. So an administrative safeguard, as an example, would be background checks on employees. We did a assessment of one of the institutions and found that they weren't doing background checks, and they had hired some less than desirable characters that didn't need to be around student data. So, something as simple as background checks is an administrative safeguard. Technical safeguards could include things like MFA being in place, multi-factor authentication. That is, that whenever you log into your email or Microsoft 365, you get that alert on your phone. Maybe it's a push notification that you say, yes, it's me, or you have to type in a number. That type of technical safeguard, or monitoring of systems, could be an additional type of technical safeguard. And then lastly, we also have physical safeguards. That could be access to file cabinets, access to server data rooms, facilities access, HID proximity cards, different types of physical access to records, whether they be in a paper or electronic format. So as we review those administrative, technical, and physical safeguards, how are we protecting each of these areas? Why are we protecting each of these areas? And then who is responsible and accountable for that? We'll talk about all of these things as we go through the presentation today. We hear a lot from our clients, and depending on which type of persona we're talking to, whether that's a CFO or a CISO or an IT director, about technical safeguards. A lot of times we get involved, we're talking with an IT director, and we can really get down into the weeds about technical safeguards, but all the rest of these are equally as important. And a question that we've had come up a few times about specifically policies is, why can't ChatGPT just design my information security program for me? So we'll talk a little more about AI, and I know tomorrow you're going to hear from Ray Bestie about AI, but it isn't an end of everything, right? So it's not something that can just determine your policy, implement a standard. You've got to think about, specifically to your institution, how that information security program plays into those controls, which we'll talk about. So your policy is a document, comes out, says, here's our policy for password protection, here's what we're going to do. The standard is how you implement that. ChatGPT may be able to provide a policy document for you of some sort, but that implementation still has to be done. Also, it should be reviewed by someone who has the expertise within the GLBA or other compliance that you fall under. So as we move from the history, we'll talk about the review of current requirements. So the current requirements for GLBA include designating a qualified individual to implement and supervise your company's information security program. So we talked about that ISP. We're going to develop this information security program. We've got to have someone to manage it and implement it. We can't just write the document, say that we've done it. That's not implementation. That's just drafting a document. So this can be someone inside or outside the organization. We work with small cosmetology schools all the way up to large public institutions of higher learning. And there's different types of qualified individuals. The one who works for that 20-employee salon school is going to be very different from someone who works at a 30,000 enrollment university, more than likely. So the requirement still allows for that person to be inside or outside the organization. We're also going to conduct a risk assessment as a part of the GLBA requirement. So as we're looking at that, again, we're going to look at that risk assessment and see what a good risk assessment looks like. Our information security program, that documentation, must be based on a form of risk assessment. For those that are larger than 5,000 records, this risk assessment has to be written, and it's got to include a few additional items as well. One of those is, how are we evaluating risks and threats? What is that criteria? How are we assessing the confidentiality, integrity, and availability of information systems and consumer information? And then how are we taking those results from that risk assessment and mitigating or accepting those risks? The risk profile, having a risk criteria workshop, activities like this will help us determine what level of risk we can take. For example, again, we go back to the small salon school maybe. $1 million risk to a small salon school may put it under forever. $1 million risk to a 30,000 enrollment university, while somewhat large, might be accepted depending on what mitigating controls have to be put in place. If it costs $10 million to mitigate the $1 million risk, maybe not do that. And then we're also going to periodically perform additional risk assessments, and we'll talk about what that means. So continuing on, review of the current requirements. We've designated our qualified individual. We've conducted a risk assessment. What comes next? We're going to implement safeguards to control risk based on those risk assessment findings. When we look at access controls, for example, who has access to information? How do we manage that access? Are we implementing least privilege access, whereas someone who works in or an executive assistant in the dean's office doesn't need access to financial data that the CFO has? Are we making sure that those access controls are in place? Also, where are we storing all the sensitive information? Is it on premise? Is it in the cloud? Is it a mixture of both? Are we making sure that those cloud systems have the same types of controls that we do on premise? Just because it's in the cloud doesn't mean that it's automatically secure. This is a common misconception we get in our industry. We think, hey, we put it up in Microsoft Azure, it's not a problem anymore. You still have to secure that data. It's your responsibility, my responsibility, to make sure that that data is secured within that cloud system. Also, we have to encrypt the data. So in transit and on systems, the data must be encrypted. We're also going to assess our applications, making sure that those that are developed securely in-house are testing of our security of externally developed applications. We're going to make sure that we're testing those. We talked about MFA a little bit earlier. This is something you know, along with something that you have. Again, for example, multi-factor authentication, I log in with a password, then I receive a text alert on my phone, something that I know, something that I have. We also need to ensure that we're disposing of that customer data securely. When we think about disposing of the customer data, we think about a couple of different items. One of those would be records retention policies. How long are we keeping that data on our servers? How long do we need to keep it for compliance reasons or legal reasons? And then when we are getting rid of that data, how are we destroying it? Are we physically destroying that media? Are we getting information from a data destruction company or an affidavit that shows that that data has been destroyed? And then last but certainly not least, we're going to continue looking through logs, maintaining a log of user activity, using third-party tools and some of the built-in tools for Windows that you have for third-party monitoring. So why is it important to regularly monitor and test the effectiveness of the safeguards? I like to think about it in a pretty simple example that most of us hopefully will resonate. We think about an alarm system in our home or our business. It's great if our alarm is going off, but who is coming to help if you're not monitoring the system? If you don't pay for that monitoring, if you don't have it hooked up to a monitoring system who's going to call the police, dispatch the police, the alarm could be blaring and going off, but nothing's going to happen. And if you don't test it from time to time, how do you know it's going to work when you need it, which is the most important time? So we want to make sure that we're monitoring and testing the effectiveness of the safeguards that we've talked about. Again, we'll reiterate that greater than 5,000 records, we must conduct an annual penetration test. We'll talk about what a good one looks like shortly, as well as vulnerability assessments, including system-wide scans biannually. So we want to make sure that we're doing the penetration testing, as well as scanning at least biannually. I would recommend monthly or even weekly if it's affordable. We're also wanting to train our staff. It's surprising to me, we've talked about security awareness training for at least 15 years, it feels like, 10 to 15 years. We provide security awareness training to our staff, but the Verizon Wireless Data Breach Report of last year, which came out in June of 2024, showed that almost 70% of breaches still involve the human element. So while we're getting better, and that number has come down over the years, still 2/3 of breaches involved somewhat of a human element. So we've got to continually train our staff, provide that security awareness training, and keep that top of mind day in and day out. You've heard the old adage, you're only as strong as your weakest link. We've got different types of training that's available. There's most commonly people think about phishing training with companies like KnowBe4. There's also scenario simulations, 15 to 20-minute refreshers on cybersecurity awareness, disaster recovery planning. Another one that now we probably take a little more seriously than we did 10 years ago is pandemic planning. We used to work with banks I did personally back in the early 2010s. And one of the things that was starting to go through the banking system was preparation for pandemic planning. And a lot of the bank presidents, the CISOs and the other officers of the bank that I work with really kind of laughed it off and said, we haven't had a pandemic in how long? There's no way that's ever going to be something that we deal with. We all lived through it 5 years ago now. We know that it can happen. We understand that it's something we need to be prepared for. And then another requirement is monitoring service providers. So as you're getting service providers in, ask them for what safeguards they're using. Make sure that, are they SOC compliant? They need to be. If they're housing your data, can they give you that SOC report? Do they perform regular risk assessments? Are they doing pen tests? Can they provide you an attestation of penetration testing from their provider? So we want to make sure that these service providers are doing the same things that we are, because they are potentially housing that data for us. Also, do we have a third-party vendor management program in place? How are you systematically going through those third-party vendors and service providers that you work with to ensure that they are staying compliant and that they are taking the appropriate safeguards with your client data? You can also ask for references. That's pretty common in our industry. Ask those service providers for references in higher education or similar vertical to show that they understand the industry needs. Back up here. Also, we want to keep our information security program current. So again, we could have ChatGPT write it for us if we want to, but that's not going to keep it current. These things change almost on a daily basis. We want to make sure that we're upgrading our information security program as new technologies emerge. or when we have major changes in the way that we handle data. An example of this would be, let's say you implement a new SIS system. You've moved your data, it's moved from on-premise to the cloud for our purpose of our example. We want to make sure that our information security program reflects those changes, that we've updated it, and that we understand how that data is being handled now versus how it was before. We also need to create a written incident response plan if we're among those with greater than 5,000 records. And while this requirement is generally for those with greater than 5,000 records, I think it isn't a bad idea for smaller institutions anyway. Here at Sikich, we in our cybersecurity team, we see incidents at least once a week on average, sometimes more often. And it really, you don't want it to be the thing that causes you a lot of angst at the end of the day, right? Because we see typically the amount of money that you're going to spend, depending on if records are breached, and we can get into the definition of a breach as a legal definition and all these other things. But we typically see the amount of money being anywhere from $40,000 to $100,000, and sometimes that can be per record depending on the exfiltration of data. So we want to make sure that we have an incident response plan should something happen. We want to understand how are we communicating to our clients, our students, or employees, and the public? Who owns that responsibility? How do we communicate to our internal stakeholders? How are we isolating and not destroying artifacts for forensic investigators to review? So a lot of times during a data breach or an incident, we see kind of the scrambling to get rid of things, move things, delete them, and honestly, that could be one of the last things you want to do because it kind of deletes the paper trail, if you will, of where that attacker came from. In that incident response plan, we want to make sure that we have specific internal processes in place to respond to that event. We want to have defined roles and responsibilities, who's going to be taking point on certain things. We want to have a systematic procedure for documenting and reporting those events. We want to understand how we coordinate with external entities. Do we engage our legal counsel immediately? Do we inform the FBI? We'll talk about the new data breach requirement for GLBA. When do we need to send information out about that? All of these things should be included in the incident response plan. And if you do, unfortunately, suffer an incident, conducting a post-mortem on the incident is an important way to prevent those from happening in the future. What happened? How did it happen? Why did it happen? What can we do to shore up our safeguards to ensure it doesn't happen again? And then also, testing the plan is one of the most important. It's great to have the incident response plan, but if we're not testing the plan and ensuring that it's staying current, how do we know it's going to work whenever something happens? Are we doing tabletop exercises? Are we doing annual reviews of the plan? These are things that will help test that incident response plan. As we continue on the current requirements, you also have to require a qualified individual to report to the board of directors or appropriate governing body annually. So what this report should entail, and it doesn't have to be a 150-page report, really it can be an executive summary, really showing the overall status of your information security program. If you're working with a program that does some sort of risk-based approach through your risk assessment, maybe has some scoring. Well, what do your scores look like this year versus what they looked last year? Some of that executive type level information to provide to the board because they're making decisions on leadership, budget, overall status of security from these reports. So making sure that these reports are accurate can help secure budget for some of these things in the future because they assist with strategic purchases and investments in security. And then also material matters related to the information security program need to be included in this governing body report. That could be risk assessments, pen test results, risk management. And this again is a requirement for those with greater than 5,000 records. So as we kind of look into our crystal ball here at Sikich as best we can anyway, and listening to some of the lobbying that's going on in DC and some of the other things around the industry that we see, we do have an expectation that at some point the department is going to come out and promulgate a rule that includes NIST SP 800-171 as the risk assessment standard of choice. Again, this is not in stone yet, but we are hearing a lot of murmurs about this. So as we take a step back and think about it, why use NIST 800-171? I think there's a few reasons for this. One of those is that it has a set of 110 controls and 14 control domains. So it's very thorough. You may use the CIS Top 18, which has 18 controls. NIST really gets deep into the individual controls and requirements. It also aligns with the CMMC, or Cybersecurity Maturity Model certification. And this certification is for those who are working with the Department of Defense. So some of our larger institutions that we work with have access to what's called Controlled Unclassified Information, or CUI. Told you we love acronyms here. Here they are. They work with CUI, and those organizations are being required to implement NIST 800-171. And I would assume, and we're kind of thinking that because of that, we may see the department come in and say, we're going to use 800-171 for GLBA as well, because at that point you are also looking at what's considered controlled unclassified information, the PII, personally identifiable information, potentially PHI, health information if you run health centers, and those sorts of activities. So CUI is considered information that is sensitive in nature, but not classified. And I could see also in the future of GLBA, right now we kind of just have this checkbox type. Are you doing a risk assessment? Yes. Are you not doing a risk assessment? You fill the check mark out, great, good. Not all risk assessments are created alike. So I think having a more standardized way to evaluate, like they do with the CMMC certification, they have a requirement. They have a negative scoring system from -203 to 110. And they have a requirement of, individuals making a score of 88 to be in compliance. I could see something similar in the future, and we anticipate the possibility of something like that being implemented in the future for GLBA. So as we think about those standards that NIST 800-171, and we think about assessing risk and how we assess risk, let's turn to looking at the components of a good risk assessment. So we want to make sure that our risk assessment we're doing for GLBA purposes is based on a framework such as NIST 800-171 or CIS, the Center for Internet Security, but that it provides clear scoping and objectives. So I want to make a note here for everyone that there is a large difference between a gap analysis and a compliance program. So as we think about risk assessments, a lot of times in the industry, what we see, so we see a lower cost provider come in, they will assess at a very high level, maybe the 110 controls of 800-171, and they'll drop off a PDF with really just defining whether that risk exists or not. Yes, the risk exists. No, it doesn't. So that's really more of a gap analysis, and it's certainly a good thing, and I think it's a first step potentially. But I think as we think about what we would consider a good risk assessment in cybersecurity terms, we want to take it a step further than just delivering that gap analysis and really look at an overall compliance program. And a compliance program meaning a comprehensive, ongoing framework to ensure that your organization is consistently meeting those compliance standards, in this case, the GLBA. So as we think about that, moving into a compliance program, we're probably going to see things like risk identification and risk analysis. We're going to look at identifying risk types, whether those are operational, financial, strategic. An example of operational risk would be a risk of loss due to failed internal processes, maybe a data breach due to inadequate security measures. A financial risk could be a loss resulting from financial transactions. That would be extending credit to someone who couldn't pay the money back. A strategic risk, meaning failing to implement an effective business strategy, such as failing to adapt to changes in the market or to new technologies. And then compliance risk, which is resulting obviously from non-compliance. the FTC or GLBA in this case, with laws and regulations, fines being imposed of the FTC of up to 100,000 per incident. So that would potentially be a fine imposed for a certain number of records being breached, and then also on top of whatever you might pay to mitigate that breach. So activities of a good risk identification and risk analysis program include interviews. So we're going to interview different individuals as part of the organization to determine things like vulnerability and patch management, identification and authorization, privacy measures, and again, incident response. And then we're going to address the risks that we've come up with during that risk identification and risk analysis, right? So when we determine what those risks are, we're going to develop and select an appropriate response. Again, sometimes the appropriate response is to accept the risk because doing something about the risk may cost more than what it's worth. We can also avoid the risk, we can mitigate the risk, or we can transfer the risk overall. Then also we'll have a policies and procedures review. Again, we'll take a look at that information security program, make sure that it's up to date, make sure that it has implemented new technologies, new processes, new things that have happened, or ways of handling information. These would be things like your incident response plan or incident response policy and access control policies. As we dive a little bit deeper into a risk analysis, I won't spend a whole lot of time here, but I just want you to see what you might see on a report for a better or a good risk assessment. So as we look at an acceptable risk threshold or determining the likelihood and impacts of a risk and what that means, we take the likelihood, which is how likely is that to occur? How likely is that incident or that control to occur? Could be not at all. It could be currently happening or anywhere in between. And again, we look at that 5 being a score of something severe. That would be severe financial loss, reputational harm, 5,000 or more records impacted, interruption of business operations. And we go all the way down to that score of 1, which could be something that has no financial impact to the organization, no reputational impact, no records impact. And we define this acceptable risk as a score of less than or equal to 6. So we take the likelihood times the impact, that generates a score. We want that to be less than or equal to 6. As you can see in the impact times likelihood starting at 6, these are all acceptable to the right-hand side. And then the ones that are red and yellow are unacceptable risks that we have. And definitely in those unacceptable risks, as we look through those, we're going to want to make sure that we're doing something or have some sort of mitigating control in effect to make sure that we don't have anything happen from that risk. And again, the risk analysis example, it's a lot on this slide, apologize for that, but really just wanted to cover quite a bit in one slide here. And we go back to that risk heat map you saw on the earlier slide. We see these are our areas. This particular risk we scored at a level of 20. We found out in this particular case, our fictitious company, Acme, is having a threat of abusive access or out of process change to systems. We saw that as an imminent likelihood and a high impact to them, and then therefore scored the risk at a 20. So this would be done for all 110 controls, and you would be able to take a look at the summary of vulnerabilities, which is this information here, and be able to see which ones are the most important. So we see often scanning for vulnerabilities, people aren't implementing scans, they aren't periodically doing what they're supposed to do. Remediating vulnerabilities, they do scan, but they don't go and remediate. Providing privacy and security notices, want to make sure that we're doing that. So just looking through all of the 110 controls and what can be done out of this is what's called a plan of action and milestones. So we've had our risk identification, our risk analysis, where we've sat down and we've said, here are our risks, this is what they look like. And then we've gone and we've done our risk analysis to take that further and say, here's the scoring of those risks. That's what you see here. The next step beyond that is implementing that plan of action and milestones. So who's responsible for fixing this? What are the timelines for doing it? What happens if we don't do it? What do we expect if we do have it mitigated? And commonly in GLBA, a couple of the others that we see are lack of incident response plan and updating. I know I've hit on that quite a few times. I talked with one of our principal consultants the other day, and they mentioned again that this is one we see over and over. Or we see that the incident response plan has been put in place, but it really doesn't cover everything that it needs to. And then also we see the lack of periodic risk assessments.
One of the questions that, as you were going through, and you kind of alluded to just the human element in terms of this, right? In terms of 68% of these incidents involve some sort of human error for that. And I know, internally here at Sikich, we obviously have our testing that we do and sending out the phishing emails to determine that, and hand up, shame on me for I think after 20 years finally got one that I was like, oh, this looks legitimate, and did not pay enough attention to it there. So it is something that even if you are, I think, aware of it and equipped of it, reinforcing that with folks is critically important. How is there a recommendation or kind of a frequency that those those types of tests that we see that are kind of is a best practice in that space?
Yeah, I'd say a couple of different things. One would be, it depends on the size and scope of the organization. So, as you get into the larger mid-market enterprise where you've got, 1,000, 2,000, 5,000 plus employees, it may be something that you do on a monthly basis or potentially a quarterly basis. I would say kind of the litmus test in the industry right now is quarterly, just because that keeps it somewhat top of mind, at least every 90 days. We all get really busy. There's a lot going on. So, I think the biggest struggle though is just keeping it top of mind. So I would say do it more often, but again, I'm a cybersecurity practitioner. I'm going to say that. But also, I think monthly is a great cadence, but at a minimum, I would say quarterly is probably what you want to aim for.
That's helpful. And I think that top of mind piece too, and I think one of the overarching themes on and that you've kind of hit on, and I know we'll continue to in terms of looking at this, is this is such an area that requires that proactive look at things, right? This if you're responsive when it comes to cybersecurity, it's too late. Like the damage likely has been done in some way, shape, or form in terms of one of those categories that you highlighted there. So I think just reinforcing for for our attendees and our group here, just this is something where the investment up front and doing it right and being thorough with it is important. It's necessary, and can save you a a lot of potential headache on the back end there. The one other
There's a
question
good
I had.
balance too,
Oh
right,
yeah.
Anthony, where it's like we don't the analogy I like to use, we don't want to put $1 million fence around $100 horse at the end of the day.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, we do want to invest in these things. However, again, that's I think where the risk analysis, the risk identification, understanding your acceptable risk criteria at the organizational level is important.
Absolutely. And then just the last question kind of that I had as you were kind of going through some of these things initially, Jeff, is, we've all heard about the different types of, attacks that are out there in terms of what we're seeing from our group and our side of things there. I know I've had several clients who have had, the ransomware type attacks in recent, within the last, several months, years, et cetera, in terms of that. Are we seeing a particular type of attacks or efforts on kind of the nefarious bad actor side of things more than others right now?
Yeah, there's three that really stand out right now. One of those is ransomware, you touched on. So that's someone coming in and saying, "Hey, I've got all your data. I need $2 million by 48 hours from now, or I'm going to publish it to the rest of the world, put it on the dark web." So you've got ransomware, business email compromise, which is what you referenced about clicking the bad link, not knowing that it's a bad link. Once you click the bad link, either malware gets installed and then they have access to that sort of thing. And then the last would be social engineering. So we're still seeing a lot of social engineering attacks. where people are posing as Anthony Cervini and sending an email out, and it's really not you. We can go in the headers and footers and all these other places and look and see that it's not you. So just staying vigilant. We see in those types of attacks a lot of times the use of either foreign characters that look like Arabic numerals and letters. So they'll come in and they'll put maybe a Greek letter that looks very similar to one that we use in English. You don't really recognize it. And therefore, it looks like maybe the E looks like the E in a Greek language, that sort of thing. So really sophisticated in a lot of ways with some of these attacks.
No, absolutely. I think it's always kind of, I mean, in a, I guess, from a morbidity standpoint, from the IT and the postmortem side of things there, right? It's terrifying and fascinating all in the same breath in terms of some of what these folks are doing in terms of that, and trying to be able to do that. And everybody knows that, we get, many people are getting, hundreds plus emails a day in terms of that. So, that vigilance, like you hit on, is so important for folks to be able to be aware of that. And just, I know everybody wants to, try to clear out the inbox and then cross things off the to-do list there, but not at the sake of, kind of putting yourself in a bad position. So thanks for entertaining a few of those, and I'll
Yeah.
let you get back to the deck here.
All right. Great. Keep it coming. So as we look at components of a good penetration test, this is the next section. We talked about components of good risk assessment. We talked about all of the different types of safeguards we need to have in place. We know that if we're greater than 5,000 records, that we need to have annual penetration testing. And so now we're going to look at, as you're evaluating those vendors for pen testing, what that should look like, what you should expect to see in those types of tests. So as we look at the penetration testing, there's a certain methodology that is pretty well commonly accepted in the industry, and that's called NIST 800-115. It's not going to be on the quiz. You don't have to memorize that, but in case you want to look and dive deeper into this, that's a place that you could go and search and find that information. That's the technical guide to testing and assessment. So that's looking at the penetration test methodology. So the first thing for a penetration test that we're going to look at is, what are we testing? We're going to look at that in the rules of engagement. And part of that is saying, are we only testing external IP addresses? So those things that are available external to the network, such as your firewalls, those types of devices. Or are we also taking a look at internal penetration testing? And I'll tell you, one of the reasons to look at internal and external, I know a lot of folks are just doing kind of external, check the box, get the pen test done. That's a great exercise. Keep doing that. I would encourage you at some point to either budget or look at budgeting for internal testing as well. And here's the reason why. We talk about those types of attacks that we discussed earlier. And some of those include kind of a lying in wait. So the attacker gets onto the network and they sit and they monitor things. You don't know that they're there. This is called mean time to detection in that Verizon data breach report that we talked about. And the average mean time to detection from when a hacker gets on to when it's discovered is 7 months. That number ought to really make people think for a little bit, right? So what they do in this time is they go and we'll use Anthony as the example. We'll say they go and they monitor Anthony's email. They see who his subordinates are. They see who his superiors are. They see how he writes in his emails, what he's writing. If he approves invoices or sends invoices off for approval, they learn that chain. They learn the business process so that whenever they do formulate an attack, they make it look just as similar as they can to what Anthony is doing. That's done from the internal side of the network. So not only would the internal penetration test hopefully show how these things could be done, it also would work on some of those least privilege access and other items that we discussed earlier to see, hey, does Anthony have access to certain things either that he shouldn't, or that if in the hands of an attacker would be very, very detrimental to Sikich, right? So these are some of the things we'll be doing during the internal penetration testing. So look at external and internal both would be one of the recommendations I would have. External is going to fulfill the requirement. So if you just want to check the box, do the external pen test, go about your day. Definitely think about both. So once we've determined the scope of that engagement, where we're saying we're going to do external and internal, the net organization is going to look at reconnaissance. And what that means in this case and in this penetration test is gathering pertinent information about the organization, their key employees, publicly available information, things that I can find on the internet, you could find on the internet, things that exist on the dark web, understanding what things are available and how we could use those to exploit the business. The next step of this is to do a vulnerability detection. That could be with application security, again, access control, who has access to what, network security, that is the network devices, are they up to date, have they been patched, operating system security rather, is the OS up to date, are we using the latest security patches, have we gotten rid of all end of life operating systems that are out there that no longer have any patches? And then also user management, that is the security of accounts, passwords, what types of multi-factor authentication, what are our password requirements, how are we implementing those? That's kind of the pre-work for the pen test. So a good penetration tester is going to go in, define the scope, look at what they can find, and then see what types of vulnerabilities might exist. And then comes the fun part, at least for the pen tester, and that's the attack and penetration or exploitation of the network. So they're going to take all of those things they've done in the first part of the engagement, and they're going to go after it. They're going to find, can they access Anthony's email? We'll continue to use you, Anthony. Sorry about that. Can he access your email? Can they access your SharePoint? Can they access other things that you have access to in order to either escalate privileges or eventually gain domain administrator access? And from that point, you will receive a report. So once all those activities have been done, and I kind of condensed them down for today's purposes, and we could definitely go into a lot more detail about all of these, you'll receive a report. We'll talk about what type of reporting and what it should include. But pen test is it's also different from vulnerability scanning. So that's another point I want to make and ensure that we're not using those words interchangeably. So a vulnerability scan is identifying the vulnerabilities at the surface level, typically using an automated tool like a Nessus scan or other Malwarebytes, different types of organizations that do these scans, spits out a report, tells you a little score, almost like a Credit Karma credit score, good, better, worst, that sort of thing. A penetration test is taking things a step further and exploiting those vulnerabilities to dive deeper beneath the surface using more of a manual approach. So an actual person is sitting on the other side attempting to gain access into the network. So again, I like my analogy sometimes. I think about vulnerability scanning when we go back to our home and our alarm and everything. Vulnerability scan is just kind of jiggling the handles of the door, checking the windows, seeing if the door opens up, seeing if the window opens up for me. Whereas a penetration test is a full-on robbery where the robber tries to come through that weak point. They jiggle the handle, they open the window, they come in, they steal whatever they want to steal, and they go on their way without you knowing. So that's kind of the difference between the vulnerability scanning and pen testing. Also, I should note that time needs to be allowed for remediation and retesting for a pen test. So without being too technical and things today, because I know we have a varied audience here, we've done our pen test. We want to make sure that we get those results from the pen test, the report, and that we allow some time so that we can remediate, that is to fix some of the problems that we found. And then we also retest to determine that those were actually fixed. So as you're evaluating vendors for penetration testing, I would have you ask them for a sample report. That's definitely one step. I mean, you can do your due diligence and all the other third-party vendor management things that you do, but also make sure that you're asking for a penetration test report. Make sure that it includes an executive summary. Also that it includes what's called an attack narrative. That was what I talked about once we're doing the full-on robbery. That explains how the vulnerabilities are discovered and provides a step-by-step review. A lot of reports skip this, or they kind of include a smaller amount of information in the findings. With companies like Sikich and many others who do pen testing, you're going to find a report that has screenshots, detailed instructions of how things were found, and it's also going to cross-reference common attack frameworks. So some of the guys that work on cyber defense, those that are fighting against some of the hackers, have developed a MITRE ATT&CK framework and other types of frameworks that show how techniques are commonly done. And the reporting should include some references to these and how they fit into that framework. Also, you should expect that the report would include, detailed findings with clear remediation instructions. So again, back to the gap analysis, we don't just want to find where the penetration testing flaws are. We want information about how to remediate those. And then we want to work with our IT staff, our managed service provider, and others to remediate those. Typically, we're going to remediate those within 30 to 60 days. And there's a reason why we want to do it within that 60-day time frame. And I think we all know change is the one constant we have. And if we go beyond that 60 days, there may be too many changes in the network that may require retesting of the environment, or maybe something that was found no longer even exists anymore. So we want to make sure that that's done in a timely fashion. Typically 30 to 60 days is kind of an industry standard there. We also want to make sure that remediation ensures the finding is addressed appropriately. So now we'll move to the 2024 rule change and data breach requirement. So as we look at one of the changes to the rules that was effective in May of last year, and this aligns with a lot of the other compliances that we work with, but it requires non-banking institutions that fall under the FTC jurisdiction, so that includes GLBA, to report data breaches affecting 500 or more people. So a few items to note here. This was effective in May of 2024, so we want to make sure that we're including that as a part of our policies and procedures and standards that we have in place, potentially our incident response plans as well. And we want to try to avoid these things, of course, but the biggest reasons for this would be both the reputational damage and financial damage. So as we go back to that risk analysis and we think about a data breach, I would say that would fall very high on the list of damage or potential for damage to organizations, especially that with 500 or more. So we want to make sure we're updating our IR plans. So what's required of this in this non-banking institution, less than 30 days after the discovery of the breach, is name of the organization, a description of the information involved in the event, and a date range if it can be determined, or maybe it's TBD until you work with someone in forensics or forensic investigator. And then also the number of affected records, along with a general description of the event. So this is clearly something you would work not only internally, but potentially with your external counsel or internal counsel there to make sure that you're following this requirement and sending out the information that needs to be sent out for that. So that is effective as of last year. Last time we did a presentation similar to this, it wasn't in effect. It is now as of May. So I have a few common questions that we have from our clients, but before that, I wanted to ask Anthony if there had been any questions that we didn't get answered or that came up during the presentation.
Nothing so far on that, Jeff, but if you do have questions, I encourage you to submit those in the Q&A in the chat section there, or the question section there. You can go ahead and submit those as Jeff goes through some of the common questions that he gets and that the team gets as we go through this process.
Yeah, certainly. So yeah, I kind of took a step back here and thought over the last 2 years, I've done a lot of these engagements, had a lot of these conversations, even more so than the engagements. And what are some of the questions that I get over and over again that the clients are asking regarding these GLBA requirements. And we've addressed some of these, but we'll just reiterate some as well. So one is, how often do I have to perform a risk assessment? So currently, again, we'll say currently because nothing has changed yet, the FTC doesn't mandate a specific time frame. They say periodic risk assessments is what the Code of Federal Regulation says. So what we're advising our clients in the cybersecurity world is typically we want to perform that risk assessment every 2 to 3 years. So when we think back to, I mentioned CMMC earlier, or the DoD compliance, they're requiring triennial risk assessment, so every 3 years. We kind of base our assumption off of that as well and said about every 3 years, or when there's major changes in the way that data is handled. We talked about an example of the student information system being upgraded, changed, moved. Could be implementing a new ERP system like NetSuite, Oracle, one of those. And just making sure that you're at least making some sort of update to the risk assessment or reassessing the risk of that data whenever it gets moved to another location or with a different vendor. So do I have to designate a qualified individual from outside my organization? So the qualified individual requirement can be someone inside or outside the organization. But what I would consider is thinking about what resources you have internally to perform these duties. Not only what resources do you have, but what bandwidth do these resources have to perform these duties. For smaller organizations, this can be the CEO, the CIO, someone else. For larger organizations, it might be an IT security committee, executive council, an information security management group, depending on what you have within your organization. So what if all my student data is in the cloud? So again, as we talked about earlier, even though everything's in the cloud, there's still access to it via the internet. So there's almost the potential for a greater surface area threat because it's online. Before we had all of our files in file cabinets. It's pretty easy to lock the file cabinet up, close the door, lock the system down, set the alarm, go about our merry way. But now things in the cloud are publicly available on the internet because that's how we access them. So we want to make sure that we're still looking through and understanding the risk to that data. Doesn't my third-party servicer have these in place already? Hopefully the answer is yes, that the third-party servicer is doing these things. But there's also the expectation that you are evaluating that third-party servicer as well. So you're still ultimately responsible at the end of the day for authorized and unauthorized access to that tenant information. So you're going to want to make sure that you do have that third-party risk management in place. You're looking at those third-party vendors that you have. You're sending them assessments. You're asking them, you may have seen this similarly on your cybersecurity or cybersecurity insurance, rather, if you have cyber insurance. Your insurance company is asking, have you performed a pen test? Do you have an information security program? Do you have an incident response plan? Those sort of things. Do you have an incident response retainer? You should be asking a lot of these questions to your third-party servicer as well as part of the vendor management program so that they can send you these types of artifacts. So another common question is, will doing these GLBA things help reduce my cyber insurance premiums? So there's a possibility that it could reduce your cyber insurance premiums. I know that I've worked with clients, and this is your mileage may vary. It's going to be different depending on the type of cyber insurance that you have, that got discounts for performing pen testing or for showing risk assessment, POAM progress. That's the plan of action and milestones that we talked about earlier, or that plan to mitigate risk. So definitely check in with your cyber insurance company if you are doing pen testing. Ask them if they do provide that. Again, it's different from company to company as to how they go about defining those premiums. And then another one I get is cyber insurance required? Nope, cyber insurance is not required, but I would strongly recommend you as a business looking into it, if you can afford it. Obviously, I can't run your business. I can't tell you what to do, but definitely I would consider it if it's something that your business can afford, because I think the benefits outweigh the premium in a lot of cases. And definitely, there's due diligence can be done on that, and we can give recommendations on cyber insurance providers that are very good. So then last common question that we get is, can we perform the penetration test and risk assessment internally? So the short answer is yes. There's no third party requirement for the penetration testing or risk assessment. So if you have the expertise, if you're one of those larger organizations, and you say, hey, we've got staff who used to work as pen testers, or that's what they do day in and day out, certainly you can do that. Same thing with the risk assessment as well. I would suggest at some point in time you entertain the opportunity of a third party doing that. It's just one of those things. It's one of the things about like audit independence with the cyber practice and the CPA practice that Anthony works with, right? If we're doing audit and the test work for a client, we can't go in and do ongoing vCISO services for them, because it would be like saying, hey, yeah, Sikich, you're doing a great job. And then Sikich on the other side says we're doing a great job. Can't do that. So I would consider as well maybe looking at a third party to do the risk assessment, just to give you another set of eyes and someone else to take a look at your overall risk.
So Jeff, we did have one question come in, and I'll comment a little bit on this because it kind of goes down the a path here and a little bit of kind of just the unknown in terms of this. But the question is, do you foresee a reduction in emphasis in compliance enforcement with the new administration? Is the DOE really likely to require NIST 171 when we've heard a lot of discussions in regards to are they going to completely disband the Department of Education? So I'll just kind of general comment here, and feel free to add anything that you'd like to here. But certainly we have an administration who is more prone to deregulation in some of these areas here. GLBA falls under the CPFB, ultimately, and obviously we have a lot of public, a lot of press in the last week about new head of that organization coming in, and a lot of things changing there. So a lot of this, it's too early to tell in terms of kind of what to expect on that. I was at a meeting where I had a school district ask me recently, well, what's the impact of, if the DOE gets disbanded? And I said, that's a larger scale discussion for us to navigate in there. But ultimately, a lot of what Jeff covered today, my perspective on this from a risk standpoint too, is that even if there is a deregulation or a move towards deregulation in some of these areas, it doesn't change the fact that there are still risks there. There's still exposure and things that you need to assess for your organization on that. So, Jeff, I don't know if you have anything to add on that as we kind of
Yeah,
wrap up
I
the
would just
session
say,
here.
you're spot on with that. The other thing I would add is that we do see, regardless of who becomes the president at the time and in the administration, there's often a freeze when that new incoming administration comes in to review all the different. I mean, there are tons of departments within the government, and we could talk a long time about that. But to review all of those things and see what changes they want to make that may have been done with previous. So I think we've just got a couple of slides left. I know we're getting really close on time here, so we want to be cognizant of that. Key takeaways from today: continuing to review the requirements annually, stay updated on any updates, look for future changes potentially, or maybe not, as we just discussed, but we're expecting NIST 800-171, and then also review the new rule change to ensure compliance, and make sure that you're reviewing that third-party vendor management process. So my contact information is here. I know something comes up, shoot me an email, add me on LinkedIn. Appreciate the opportunity to present this morning, and I hope everyone enjoys the rest of the Higher Education Forum. Thank you all.
Jeff, thank you so much for a fantastic presentation. Just a ton of great information this morning. So thank you again for taking the time to speak to the forum attendees on that.